Hello and welcome to the Practice of Real Estate, another episode in Tom's Next Level Exam Prep Series. I'm Tom, and I designed this series to help you pass your real estate exams, just like I've helped hundreds of my students in the past. I also urge you to watch my Welcome and my Exam Insights and Strategies videos for a complete overview of this series. You'll learn how to get the most benefit from these topical videos. And here's some real important information to have from my Welcome video. Each of my national exam topical videos is going to put you in test world. By that I mean my goal is to share with you what's going to be on the test, how it's going to show up on the test. It's because I'm only a supplement to your education provider's course materials. You have the basic information. I'm not going to reteach the entire class clearly. So as I'm giving you some test insights and some test tips, if you will, take a lot of notes. You know you're 80% more likely to recall something if you write it down. So please take a lot of notes during my video series. Okay, enough of the introductions. Let's get started with the practice of real estate. Grab your course materials, your notebook, and your positive attitude. All of those are going to help you get through this series, and let's get started. In my Exams, Insights, and Strategies video, I talk a lot about the structure and the format of the exam. Just to review, all of your test questions will be multiple choice questions, typically with 4 responses. So let's talk about how you'll be working with your broker. You'll either be an employee or an independent contractor. Frankly, most agents in today's market are independent contractors, but we're in test world here, so the test wants you to know the difference between those 2 ways you can be employed by your broker. If you're employed by your broker as an employee, then what must the broker do? Withhold taxes, they can set your work hours, and they may or may not offer you benefits. But you'll also learn that you can be employed by your broker as an independent contractor. Well, what's the difference between that and an employee? Well, as an independent contractor, and here's how this information will show up on the test. All of the following things are true of an independent contractor, except, guaranteed that'll be a test question. Probably the same question for an employee. So what things are true if you're an independent contractor? You must have a written and signed agreement with your broker. You set your own work hours, not the broker. You have to pay your own taxes. If you earn a commission check, I should say when you earn a commission check as an independent contractor, if your share of that commission is $5,000, your broker's going to hand you your share and say, here's your $5,000, go do your own taxes. Set aside your own taxes for withholding, things like that. So you have to pay your own taxes. Okay? Broker typically is not going to provide you benefits as an independent contractor because you're independent. That word has a lot of meaning. Okay? And the income that you make is based on your production. So the more you sell, the more you make. So as you review and study these materials, think about how the test question is going to be phrased. Another highly testable topic in the practice of real estate is trust accounts. Sometimes they're referred to as an earnest money account or an escrow account. Okay? What things are true for the test of a trust account? Number 1, it has to be a demand account. That simply means that the broker can get the money out whenever they want to. They can demand their money. Typically, what sort of accounts are they? A savings account. Okay, a checking account. Those are most typically trust accounts because the broker can get their money out whenever they choose. What goes in the trust account? Review that with your materials, but the short acronym to remember is OPM, other people's money. That's the purpose of a trust account, is for the broker to segregate other people's money from the broker's money. And what types of funds are we talking about that are other people's money? Earnest money from purchase agreements, maybe rents collected on behalf of a client, things like that. Any money that is not the broker money is other people's money, and that's what goes in the trust account. I want you to be sure and look for these two C words on the test, okay? These are trust account violations. So you cannot, a broker cannot, commingle or convert trust account funds. What things are true of commingling? Let's start there. Well, commingling is mixing personal and business money. The broker cannot mix those two in the trust account. The word for the test is commingling. Mixing is a good way to remember it. Okay? The broker can put some personal money in the account to maintain a required balance. So the broker opens a trust account and the bank says you got to have $500 in there to start it. So the broker puts in $500 personal money. So that's the only time that commingling is allowed. That may show up on the test also. Can the broker pay bank fees out of the trust account? They can, but the broker has to put some personal money into the trust account to pay the banking fees. So watch for those two instances on the test when it's okay for a broker to put business money into the trust account to pay banking fees and to maintain a minimum balance. Conversion is another story altogether. Conversion is a violation. That is a broker using trust account funds for personal reasons. Maybe the broker says, you know what, I'm a little behind on my rent for my office this month. I'll take a little money out of the trust account. I'll pay my rent now and then I'll put the money back a little bit later. Brokers have gone to jail for that and lost their businesses. You can't do that. That's conversion of funds, using trust funds for personal reasons. So know those two violations. Definitely, the exam is going to test you on the Federal Fair Housing protected classifications. What classes of people are protected under Federal Fair Housing Act? Well, you know, you've got your 7 classes there on the screen. Fresh corn is one of the acronyms people use to help them remember what those 7 protected classes are. But I'm going to take a little bit of time in detail with you, a little bit on each one, the testable points, the questions they usually ask about these on the test. So with that in mind, I want you to make a note in your notebook about Federal Fair Housing. Write down these 2 words, not age. Not age. Age is not a protected class in Federal Fair Housing Act. That seems to show up on the test. I'll tell you why, and here's what you want to look out for. Do you remember from your coursework, is age a protected class somewhere in real estate? Yes, it is. It's a protected class under ECOA, E-C-O-A, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So age is a protected class under ECOA, but age is not a protected class under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So this question usually shows up this way on the test. Watch for this one. All of the following are protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act, except. And they'll list 3 of these and they'll have age. And your brain is going to go, wait a minute. I know age is a protected class. And you think it might be Federal Fair Housing, but you're not sure. Now you know age is not a protected class under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Age is a protected class under ECOA. So remember that. Well, let's take a little bit more deeper dive into each of these protected classes. First of all, let's take a look at some of the dates. They may ask you about these key dates on the test. So do your best to try and commit these to memory. Writing them down, making notes is really going to help. Civil Rights Act 1866 was one protected class, and that was race. That was all the way back in 1866. Then in 1968, some protected classes were added. They may phrase the question that way. Which protected classes were added to the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968? You have color, religion, and national origin. Then there was another update in 1988. Which protected classes were added in 88? Well, you have handicap, disability, and familial status. So do your best, make some notes, and try and recall those dates. Those are the key ones they're likely to ask you about somewhere on the test. We just talked about the Federal Fair Housing Act and the 3 dates I think you should remember. There's also another date, but this is a Civil Rights Act. Civil Rights Act in 1964 and added gender identity and sexual orientation. And where did it add those? It added those for employment discrimination, and it included sexual orientation and transgender status. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Make sure you make that distinction between the Federal Fair Housing Act. I know there's a lot of stuff to remember here, but it's test world, right? Civil Rights Act 64 added gender identity. Here's some specific questions they like to ask on the test. They'll drill down in some of the protected classes and ask about particular things that it couldn't be an issue in the marketplace. So, for familial status, somewhere on the test you'll get a question. Is a pregnant woman covered by the familial status protected class? The answer is yes. Pregnant woman is qualified or qualifies for protection under the familial status. Another one is handicap disability protected class. Who does that cover? There's some key points here you want to remember for the test. Anybody with HIV or AIDS is qualified to be covered under the handicap disability protected class. One of the things they always ask about is alcohol and drug addiction. If somebody's an alcoholic or addicted to drugs and they're seeking treatment, they are covered. If they're not seeking treatment, they're not covered under the handicap and disability protected class. So remember that distinction. They are covered if they're seeking treatment. And that also applies to landlords and tenants. Whether they want to sell somebody a house or if they want to rent them an apartment. Rentals are also covered by the handicap disability protected class. You also get some questions about what are the exemptions to the Federal Fair Housing Act. Is discrimination ever allowed on a limited basis against some protected classes? Yes, of course it is. First of all, there's never any discrimination allowed, never any exemption for racial discrimination. Remember, that's the one never allowed to discriminate on race. However, a non-licensed owner renting or selling their single-family home is allowed to discriminate on some protected classes. Maybe they don't want to rent their house to somebody with 8 kids. They would discriminate based on familial status. But I want you to focus on the first sentence in that exemption. A non-licensed owner. Just make this note in your notebook. Anytime you have a real estate license, you are never allowed to discriminate against any protected classes. I'll rephrase that. There's never any exemptions for somebody who has a real estate license. But an owner without a real estate license is allowed some limited discrimination. Same thing is true with the last item on the slide. If they're going to rent an owner-occupied 1 to 4 unit property. If I own a 4-plex and I live in one of the units and I want to rent out the other 3, I might say I don't want to rent it to a bunch of kids. To a family with a lot of kids, and so I can discriminate based on familial status. So there is some limited discrimination allowed. The key point is never can be somebody with a real estate license, and then the other exemptions you want to pay attention to as you study. Here's a few other exemptions to the Federal Fair Housing Act. Senior housing. Remember these 2 percentages for the test. 80% of the occupants are 55 years or older. That qualifies as senior housing. So as long as they maintain those ratios and those numbers, they can discriminate against people. Kids, familial status primarily. Any housing that is restricted to 62 years or older. Now that might be restricted by the Department of Commerce. So it qualifies as senior housing. And also discrimination is allowed by any housing operated by an organization that limits the occupancy to their members only. I'm thinking YWCA, YMCA, maybe a woman's shelter. things like that would be allowed some discrimination. You can be pretty sure that these prohibited activities will show up on your test somewhere in some form in one of your questions. So know what they are and a brief example of each one, and so you'll be able to answer a question depending on how they ask it. They might give you the prohibited activity, or they might give you the example and have you match them up. Steering to or from areas is certainly prohibited. You can't recommend to clients that they do live or don't live in a certain area because you don't think they might fit in there, okay? You can't steer them into or out of neighborhoods. Blockbusting, also called panic selling, is knocking on somebody's door and saying, my goodness, have you seen what's happened to your real estate values? Look at your neighborhood here. Your home value is plummeting. You should sell your house fast. Well, there's still some value there, and I'd really be happy to list it for you. Boy, that's clearly a violation. Can't do that. Believe it or not, in some form along the way, over the years, things like that happen. The third prohibited activity is redlining. Now, redlining is a lender activity. Redlining is some banks who used to tell their loan officers, we don't make loans in certain neighborhoods. And they would physically draw a red line on a map inside the bank in the loan officer's office and say, we won't accept any loans in those neighborhoods because we don't like what's happening in that neighborhood. Redlining is a prohibited activity, but it's done by lenders. So remember those three. Here's some fair housing advertising rules that'll show up on the test. So I want to take a second and share these with you. You can't advertise based on a protected class. Whether families should look in this neighborhood or families should not look in this neighborhood. No matter what the protected class is, you can never advertise based on a protected class, either including or excluding that protected class. The best rule of thumb to use is describe the property. Describe the property itself, not who should buy it. That little reminder will help you get through the test. Never advertise who should buy the property. They will give you some examples in test questions that might detail who should or should not buy a property, and you know that's going to be an example of an ad that is not allowed. There'll be a question or two on your national test about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. One of the questions might be, what is the purpose of the ADA? And the purpose is to allow access to public accommodations for people with disabilities. That's why you have to have handicap accessible restrooms in public buildings. You have to have handicap accessible doorways. You see a lot of the push the button and the door opens automatically situations in commercial buildings. So what commercial buildings are affected by the ADA? Well, existing buildings have to comply when the remodel or the renovation is reasonably achievable. Reasonably achievable. However, all new commercial construction must be ADA compliant. And they have a lot of rules about the height of mirrors, the width of the doorways, things like that. But for test purposes, let's stick with that. The ADA is, purpose of it is to allow access to public accommodations to people with disabilities. And existing buildings are required to comply if it's possible. And all new construction must comply. So the question might be, all of the following are true of the ADA except. And there'll be three choices like we're talking about here. And maybe a fourth choice will be, existing buildings must comply even if it's not reasonably achievable. That would be an incorrect answer. Actually, that would be the correct answer to an except question. They don't have to do that. They always like to have a question or two on the test about the federal Sherman Antitrust Act. So you should be aware for the test of what it does, why it does it, and what it prohibits, okay? First of all, it prohibits price fixing. Brokers in a neighborhood or an area can't get together and say, why don't we all just raise our commissions 3 or 4 percentage points? If we all have the same amount, then no matter who a client lists their house with, we'll all get more money and then we can share the business, and that would be a clear violation of the Antitrust Act. It would make that price fixing illegal. Question on the test would be, why was it passed? Why should price fixing be illegal? The phrase they're looking for on the test is, it inhibits competition. Price fixing inhibits competition. So remember that for the day. You might connect those dots on the test. Okay? And they also make the overall blanket point that commissions in real estate are always negotiable. Remember that as a general rule in real estate. All commissions are always negotiable. You're also likely to see a question on the Can-Spam Act. You'll need to know again what it does. It'll come out this way probably. All of the following things are true of the Can-Spam Act except. So you need to know the details about the Can-Spam Act, okay? It only covers commercial email and messages. Commercial email and messages. It gives people the right to opt out. That's why when you get a text message or an email nowadays, you have the choice. Do you want to opt out of these messages? That's a true statement about the Can-Spam Act. And it also spells out penalties if people violate this act. So those three things are true. They're likely the ones they'll use somewhere in a test question. Now, I'm sure you talked in your classes about the National Do Not Call Registry. You're familiar with it. Here's the testable points about the Do Not Call Registry. Even if somebody's name is in the Do Not Call Registry, you as a real estate licensee may call those consumers under these two conditions, okay? So be aware of these two conditions. You can call them for 3 months after the consumer makes the first contact with you. Well, how's that going to happen? How's the consumer going to call me? Hopefully a lot. Usually this happens off what we call a sign call. When you list a house, you'll have the sign out there. You'll put the little tag down below the sign that's got your name and your phone number. I hope you get a lot of these calls. It'll go like this. Hi, my name is Tom. I'm sitting in front of a house at 123 Main Street, and I see your name is on the sign as a listing agent. Tell me about the house. You hope you get those calls a lot. That's somebody you might be able to work with, sell them that house or a different house. So they contacted you first. That's the critical key. So can you call them back again, even if their name is on the National Do Not Call Registry? Yes, you can call them back for 3 months. 3 months after they make the initial call, because they called you first. That's the key, and that's how the question will be phrased on the test. How about somebody whose name is in the Do Not Call Registry, but I just closed a deal with them? I sold them a house. I sold their listing. If you've had a transaction with that client, even if their name is on the Do Not Call list, you're allowed by law to contact them again for the next 18 months. So those are two time frames you want to be aware of. 3 months if they call you first, 18 months after you've actually had a transaction with them. Well, that wraps up this practice of real estate video. I hope you found it helpful and picked up some helpful hints for your exam. Notice I've got my list on the screen of my other national exam topical videos. These topics come from the testing company, and I'm trying to cover all the bases here. So if you want to refresh yourself on any one of these topics before you take your exam, please feel free to do that. So stay positive and stay focused, and good luck on your exam. As always, if you like my videos, you can hit the icon at the bottom. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, I'd be happy to send you updates on my career prep and my skills prep series as I add more videos to those. Please feel free to make any comments you like, and if you know somebody else who's taking their real estate exam soon, please feel free to share this video information with them. Thank you.